The bottle promised sleep. It promised peace. It promised that her baby would stop crying long enough for Mary to work the 14 hours that kept them both alive. What it never promised, and what no one ever told her, was that each amber drop was stealing her daughter one breath at a time. But Mary Brennan wasn't a monster. She was a mother trapped in a system designed to break her. If this story of how Victorian mothers poison their babies moves you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me if you have ever heard of this dark chapter in history. Manchester, England. Winter of 1867. The factory bell hadn't yet rung, but Mary Brennan was already awake. She lay in the narrow bed she shared with her 2 children, listening to the wet, rattling cough of her neighbor through the paper-thin walls. The room was cold enough that she could see her breath, pale wisps rising toward the water-stained ceiling. Somewhere in the building a baby wailed. Not hers. At least not yet. And she felt the familiar clench in her chest, that mixture of dread and exhaustion that had become as constant as her own heartbeat. Beside her, 5-year-old Thomas slept with his thumb in his mouth, his small body curled tight against the cold. And in the wooden crate that served as a cradle, 3-month-old Clara made the soft, mewling sounds that meant she would soon demand to be fed. Mary closed her eyes. Just 5 more minutes. 5 more minutes of stillness before the world demanded everything she had. But the world had never been patient with women like Mary Brennan. She rose quietly, her bare feet meeting the icy floorboards, and moved to the small window. Outside, Manchester was waking. The sky was the color of dirty dishwater, thick with coal smoke that never seemed to clear. She could see the chimneys of Thornton Mill rising in the distance, black fingers pointing accusingly at heaven. In 2 hours she would be standing at her loom, her fingers moving mechanically through motions she could perform in her sleep, and often did. Her mind drifting to this room, to her children, to the gnawing worry that never left her. Clara's mewling grew louder. Mary turned from the window and lifted her daughter from the crate, pressing the infant against her chest. Clara was small for her age, her skin carrying that bluish pallor that made Mary's heart stutter with fear every time she noticed it. The doctor, the one time Mary had scraped together enough coins to see him, had waved away her concerns. "She's a factory baby," he'd said not unkindly. "They're all a bit peaky. Fresh air would help, but—" He'd shrugged and they'd both understood. Fresh air was a luxury as unattainable as silk or silver. "Hush now," Mary whispered, swaying gently. "Hush, little one. Mama's here." But Clara would not be hushed. Her face scrunched, reddening, and the mewling became a cry, that thin, piercing wail that seemed designed by nature to be impossible to ignore. Mary glanced at Thomas, still sleeping despite the noise, and felt a surge of gratitude for his exhaustion. She could not afford to wake him. She could not afford the time it would take to soothe 2 children when the factory bell would ring in less than 2 hours, and Mrs. Grimsby, who watched the children of mill workers for a few precious pence, had made it clear that she would not accept Clara if the child was in a state. No squalling infants. The old woman had said, her mouth a thin, disapproving line. "I've got 6 others to mind. If your girl can't be peaceful, find someone else." There was no one else. Mary had already tried. She paced the small room, bouncing Clara gently, desperately. The crying continued, rising and falling like the tide, and Mary felt her own eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. She had not cried since the night William died. Crushed beneath a cartwheel on his way home from the docks, leaving her with 2 children, 17 shillings, and a grief so vast she thought it might swallow her whole. That was 4 months ago. She had not cried since. She was not sure she remembered how. "Please," she whispered to Clara. "Please, my darling. Please be still." The baby's answer was a fresh wave of wailing. Mary's eyes drifted to the shelf above the small stove, where a brown glass bottle sat beside a chipped teacup and a stub of candle. The label, faded but legible, read, "Godfrey's Cordial. For the relief of infants." Soothes colic, teething and restlessness. Safe and effective. Her neighbor Mrs. Doyle had pressed it into her hands 2 weeks ago. Every mother uses it, Mrs. Doyle had said, her voice carrying the weary authority of a woman who had raised 7 children in these same cramped rooms. A few drops and they sleep like angels. How do you think any of us manage? Mary had hesitated. There was something about the bottle that unsettled her, the amber liquid inside, the promise of peace that seemed too easy, too simple for a world that offered neither. But Mrs. Doyle had laughed at her hesitation. It's medicine, girl. You can buy it at any chemist's shop. Even the fine ladies in Mayfair use it on their babies. Do you think you're better than them? Mary did not think she was better than anyone. She simply thought that anything which promised so much must surely take something in return. But that was before 2 weeks of Clara's crying. Before the foreman's warning that her work was slipping, her attention wandering. Before Mrs. Grimsby's ultimatum. Before the exhaustion had burrowed so deep into her bones that she sometimes forgot her own name. Now, standing in the gray morning light with her daughter's screams filling the tiny room, Mary looked at that brown bottle and felt something inside her begin to crack. It's just medicine, she told herself. Every mother uses it. She crossed to the shelf. Her hands were trembling as she lifted the bottle, as she worked the cork free with fingers that felt clumsy and foreign. The liquid inside was dark, syrupy, with a sweet smell that reminded her of the treacle her mother used to make before the consumption took her. Just a few drops, she whispered. Just enough to help her sleep. She tilted the bottle over Clara's rosebud mouth. The walk to Mrs. Grimsby's house was 15 minutes through streets that were already crowded despite the early hour. Factory workers shuffled past in gray-faced clusters, their wooden clogs clattering against the cobblestones. Children darted between carts, some heading to their own shifts at the mills, others simply surviving however they could. Mary carried Clara against her chest. Thomas's small hand clutched in her own. The baby was quiet now. So quiet that Mary found herself pressing her ear to Clara's chest every few minutes, reassuring herself that the small heart was still beating. It's just sleep, she told herself. Good, peaceful sleep. That's all. But some small animal part of her brain would not stop whispering that this silence was wrong, that healthy babies did not go limp and still as cloth dolls, that she had done something terrible and there would be a price to pay. She pushed the thought away. She had no room for doubt, no space for second-guessing. The factory bell would ring, and she would either be at her loom or she would lose her position. And if she lost her position, she would lose this room. And if she lost this room, no, she would not think of that. Mrs. Grimsby's house sat at the end of a narrow alley, distinguishable from its neighbors only by the worn wooden sign above the door, children minded. Reasonable rates. Inside, the main room was crowded with small bodies in various states of distress, some crying, some staring blankly at nothing, some sleeping in a pile of rags in the corner like a litter of puppies. The old woman herself sat in a chair by the cold fireplace, knitting something gray and shapeless. She looked up as Mary entered, her eyes immediately dropping to the bundle in Mary's arms. She quiet. Yes, ma'am. Mary's voice came out steadier than she felt. She's sleeping. Mrs. Grimsby grunted, setting aside her knitting to take Clara. Her hands were rough but not unkind as she examined the infant, checking her breathing, her color, the way her small fingers curled. You've been using the cordial. Was not a question. Mary felt heat rise to her cheeks. Just a little. Just to help her settle. Smart girl. Mrs. Grimsby nodded approvingly. Can't have them screaming all day. Drives a body mad. She settled Clara into an empty crate lined with straw, barely glancing at the baby's slack face, her half-open eyes. She'll sleep till you're back. Go on then. You'll be late. Mary hesitated at the door, looking back at her daughter. Clara looked so small in that crate, so terribly still. The wrongness pressed against Mary's chest like a physical weight. But the factory bell was ringing in the distance, and Thomas was tugging at her hand, and there was no time for doubt, no room for fear. "I'll be back at 7, she said. She did not look back again. Across Manchester, in a world that might as well have been another planet, Dr. Eleanor Ashworth was preparing for battle. Her weapon of choice was a leather satchel filled with papers, mortality statistics, chemical analyses, testimonies from nurses and midwives, and the rare honest chemist. Her battlefield was a wood-paneled office in the Manchester Medical Society, where a dozen men in fine suits would shortly tell her, again, that her concerns were overblown, her methods unscientific, and her presence unwelcome. She did not care. She had stopped caring about welcome 3 years ago, when she had first begun counting the dead babies. Eleanor stood before the mirror in her modest rooms, adjusting the collar of her dress. Dark blue, severe, and deliberately chosen to convey competence rather than femininity. She was 32 years old, unmarried by choice, and possessed of a medical degree from the University of Edinburgh that half the doctors in England considered an affront to nature. Let them consider. She had work to do. "The statistics don't lie," she murmured to her reflection, rehearsing the words she would speak in less than an hour. "Infant mortality in factory districts has increased by 40% in the last decade. The common factor in nearly every case is the administration of opiate-based soothing syrups." She had the numbers. She had the evidence. What she did not have was a single person in power willing to listen. But today might be different. Today she had something new, a chemical analysis of Godfrey's Cordial conducted by a sympathetic colleague at the university. The results were damning. Each bottle contained enough opium to kill an adult if consumed in quantity. And mothers were giving it to infants, newborns, children whose bodies had no defense against such poison. She gathered her papers, her satchel, her armor of calm professionalism that she wore like a second skin. Today, she told herself. Today they will listen. But even as she spoke the words, some part of her knew better. The men of the medical society did not want to hear that the products they prescribed, the remedies they recommended, were killing children by the thousands. They did not want to hear that poverty and desperation drove mothers to poison their own babies. They wanted to believe that everything was fine, that the system was working, that the deaths were simply natural. Eleanor closed her eyes, seeing them again, the small body she had examined in workhouse morgues, the blue lips and still chests, the mothers' faces twisted with grief they did not understand. She had held their hands. She had listened to their stories and she had promised to help. "I will not let you be forgotten," she had sworn to those tiny corpses. "I will not let your deaths mean nothing." She picked up her satchel and walked out into the smoke-choked Manchester morning. Today she would fight. And whether she won or lost, she would keep fighting until someone, anyone, finally listened. Act 2, the morning everything changed. The loom was a living thing, hungry and relentless. Mary stood before it as she had stood for 3 years, her hands moving in patterns so familiar they had worn grooves into her consciousness. Thread and shuttle, warp and weft, the mechanical rhythm that had replaced her heartbeat somewhere along the way. Around her, 200 other women performed the same motions, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on nothing. The noise was tremendous, a roaring, clattering symphony of industry that made conversation impossible and thought nearly so. This was a mercy. Most days the noise filled the spaces where worry would otherwise grow. It drowned out the voice in her head that whispered of Clara's stillness, of the amber bottle, of choices made in desperation that could not be unmade. But today the noise was not enough. Mary's hands moved automatically, but her mind was 15 minutes away in Mrs. Grimsby's cramped house, where her daughter lay in a straw-lined crate. She kept seeing Clara's face, that slack, peaceful expression that should have been comforting but instead made Mary's stomach clench with something she refused to name. "She's sleeping," Mary told herself for the 100th time. "Just sleeping. Babies sleep. That's what they do." But healthy babies did not sleep like that. Healthy babies stirred and fussed and demanded attention. Healthy babies did not lie so still that you had to watch their chests to be certain they were breathing. Stop it. Stop it. She's fine. The shuttle jammed. Mary blinked, yanked from her spiral of worry by the sudden wrongness in the rhythm of her hands. She looked down at the loom, at the tangled mess of thread where smooth fabric should have been, and felt her heart stutter. Brennan? The foreman's voice cut through the mechanical roar. Mr. Hartley was a thick-necked man with small eyes and a permanent expression of disappointment. He shouldered through the narrow aisle between looms, his face reddening as he saw the damage. What in God's name have you done? I'm sorry, sir. Mary's voice came out thin, barely audible above the noise. The shuttle caught. I can fix it. Fix it? He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into flesh that was already bruised from a dozen similar encounters. You've ruined a full yard of cloth. Do you know what that costs? I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't pay for damaged goods. His voice dropped, taking on the dangerous quietness that Mary had learned to fear more than shouting. That's the third time this month, Brennan. Third time you've cost me money. Please, sir. I have children. I need this position. Then perhaps you should pay attention to your work instead of daydreaming. He released her arm with a shove that sent her stumbling against the loom. One more mistake. One more and you're out. Understand? Mary nodded, not trusting her voice. Mr. Hartley stalked away, already shouting at another worker for some other infraction. Mary stood frozen, her hands trembling, her arm throbbing where his fingers had gripped. Around her, the other women carefully did not look, did not react. They had all received the same treatment. They all knew the same fear. One more mistake. She turned back to her loom, her fingers working mechanically to untangle the mess. But her mind was elsewhere, calculating and recalculating the same impossible arithmetic she had been doing for months. If she lost this position, she would have 2 weeks' wages saved. 2 weeks to find another job, another room, another woman willing to mind her children for pennies. 2 weeks before she and Thomas and Clara would be on the streets. She had seen what happened to families on the streets. The workhouse if they were lucky. Starvation and worse if they were not. I cannot make another mistake. But how could she focus when Clara's face kept swimming before her eyes? When every beat of her heart seemed to whisper wrong, wrong, wrong? The factory bell rang for the midday break. 15 minutes to eat whatever meager food they had brought, to rest their aching hands, to remember that they were human beings and not simply extensions of the machines they served. Mary did not eat. She sat on an overturned crate in the corner of the mill yard, her bread and dripping untouched in her lap, and stared at nothing. Around her, other women clustered in small groups, sharing gossip and complaints in the precious minutes of freedom. You look poorly, love. Mary looked up to find Agnes Moore settling onto the crate beside her. Agnes was older, 40 perhaps, though she looked 60, with gray-streaked hair and hands gnarled from decades at the loom. She had been kind to Mary since William's death, offering advice and occasional scraps of food when Mary's own supplies ran short. I'm fine, Mary said automatically. You're not. Agnes's voice was gentle but firm. You've got that look. The one mothers get when something's wrong with their little ones. Mary's throat tightened. Clara was quiet this morning. Too quiet. You using the cordial? Mrs. Doyle said everyone uses it. Everyone does. Agnes nodded slowly. Doesn't make it right. Doesn't make it safe. She was silent for a moment, her weathered face unreadable. I had 5 children, you know. Before the factory. Before Manchester. Mary had not known. In the months of their acquaintance, Agnes had never mentioned family. What happened to them? Agnes's hands, resting in her lap, curled into loose fists. 2 lived to grow up. Married now, with children of their own, somewhere down south. The other 3. She trailed off, her eyes distant. The cordial took 2 of them. The youngest, she just stopped breathing one night. No warning. No sickness. Just stopped. Mary felt ice spreading through her chest. The cordial? That's what I believe. Can't prove it, of course. But I know what I saw. I know how still they went, how their lips turned blue, how they slept and wouldn't wake up no matter how I called their names. Agnes turned to look at Mary, and her eyes were bright with old grief. How much did you give her this morning? Just a few drops. Like Mrs. Doyle said. And yesterday? Mary hesitated. A few drops. And the day before? The ice in Mary's chest was spreading, creeping up her throat, making it hard to breathe. I don't remember exactly. Agnes reached out and took Mary's hand. Her grip was strong, calloused, strangely comforting. Go to her. Right now. Don't wait for the bell. I can't, Mr. Hartley said. I know what he said. I also know that you'll never forgive yourself if something happens while you're standing at that loom. Agnes squeezed her hand. Some things matter more than positions, love. Some things matter more than survival. Mary stared at her, paralyzed by indecision. The arithmetic ran through her head again. 2 weeks' wages, 2 weeks to find work, the workhouse, the streets, Thomas's thin face, Clara's blue-tinged skin. Clara's blue-tinged skin. She was on her feet before she made the conscious decision to move. Tell Mr. Hartley I was ill, she called back over her shoulder. Tell him anything. She was already running. The streets of Manchester had never seemed so long. Mary ran past carts and carriages, past vendors hawking their wares, past clusters of workers on their own midday breaks. Her lungs burned from the smoke-thick air. Her side ached. Her legs screamed for rest. She did not stop. Please, she prayed silently, desperately, to a God she was no longer certain she believed in. Please let her be all right. Please let me be wrong. Mrs. Grimsby's house came into view, and Mary felt a surge of relief so intense it nearly buckled her knees. She burst through the door without knocking, startling the old woman from her chair. My daughter? Mary gasped. Where is she? Mrs. Grimsby's face underwent a strange transformation. Confusion, then recognition, then something that looked horribly like pity. She was fussing, the old woman said slowly. Wouldn't settle. So I gave her a bit more of the cordial. Just to keep her quiet. The ice in Mary's chest became a blade. How much? Just a spoonful. Maybe 2. She wouldn't stop crying. Mary was already across the room, already kneeling beside the crate where Clara lay. Her daughter was still, so terribly, impossibly still. Her lips, which should have been pink and healthy, carried a faint blue tinge. Her chest rose and fell, but the movements were shallow, barely perceptible, too slow. Clara. Mary gathered her daughter into her arms, pressing her ear to the baby's chest. The heartbeat was there, but faint, fluttering like a bird's wing. Clara, wake up. Please wake up. The baby did not respond. Did not stir. Did not open her eyes. She just needs to sleep it off, Mrs. Grimsby said from somewhere behind her. They all get like that sometimes. She'll be right as rain by morning. Mary was not listening. She was remembering Agnes's words, how still they went, how their lips turned blue, how they slept and wouldn't wake up, and feeling something shatter inside her chest. I need a doctor. She was on her feet, Clara pressed against her heart. Where can I find a doctor? Doctor? Mrs. Grimsby laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. What doctor's going to see the likes of you? Those men charge more for one visit than you make in a month. There must be someone. Mary's voice cracked. Please. She's dying. The word hung in the air between them, terrible and true. Mrs. Grimsby's face paled. There's a woman, she said slowly, down at the free clinic on Whitworth Street. They say she's a real doctor, though I don't know how that's possible. She sees factory families, doesn't charge if you can't pay. Mary was already moving toward the door. The children, she said suddenly, remembering. Thomas? I'll keep the boy till you're back. Mrs. Grimsby's voice had lost its hardness. She looked old, suddenly old and tired and afraid. Go. Quickly. Mary went. The free clinic on Whitworth Street occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse, its windows grimy, its door propped open to admit what passed for fresh air in this part of the city. A hand-painted sign above the entrance read, "Medical aid for the working poor. All welcome." Inside, the waiting room was crowded with bodies in various states of distress: coughing men, feverish children, pregnant women with haunted eyes. The smell was overwhelming: sickness and sweat and the acrid tang of carbolic acid. Mary pushed through them all, Clara limp in her arms, until she reached the wooden counter where a harried young man was attempting to organize a stack of papers. "Please," she said. "My daughter. She won't wake up." The young man looked up, his eyes taking in Mary's disheveled appearance, her tear-streaked face, the dangerously still infant in her arms. Something in his expression shifted. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared through a door behind the counter. Mary waited. Clara's breathing seemed to be growing even shallower, each inhalation a tiny flutter that Mary could barely feel through her dress. She pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead, feeling the skin cool and clammy beneath her kiss. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. Please don't leave me. Please." The door opened and a woman emerged. She was younger than Mary had expected, early 30s perhaps, with dark hair pulled back severely from a face that was all sharp angles and intelligent eyes. She wore a simple dress beneath a white apron, and she moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who had long ago learned to waste neither time nor motion. "I'm Dr. Ashworth," she said. "Bring her through here. Quickly." Mary followed her into a small examination room that smelled of soap and medicine. There was a narrow table covered with a white sheet, shelves lined with bottles and instruments, and a single window that let in a rectangle of gray light. "Put her down here." Dr. Ashworth's hands were already moving, checking Clara's pulse, lifting her eyelids to examine her pupils, pressing a strange metal instrument to her chest. "How long has she been like this?" "I don't know. I left her this morning. She was sleeping. I thought she was just sleeping." "Has she been given anything? Any medicine?" Mary's throat closed. The admission felt like swallowing broken glass. "Godfrey's Cordial. This morning and the woman who minds her gave her more. A spoonful, maybe two." Dr. Ashworth's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "How old is she?" 3 months. Something passed across the doctor's face, a flicker of emotion quickly suppressed. She bent over Clara, working with swift, practiced movements, and Mary watched with the desperate hope of a drowning woman watching a rope descend. "Her breathing is severely depressed," Dr. Ashworth said. "The cordial, it contains opium. Large doses in infants can suppress the respiratory system to dangerous levels." "Will she?" Mary could not finish the sentence. "I'm going to try to stimulate her breathing. Keep her blood moving." Dr. Ashworth was already in motion, rubbing Clara's limbs vigorously, tilting her head back to open her airway. "Talk to her. Let her hear your voice." Mary leaned close to her daughter's ear, tears streaming freely now, and began to speak. "Clara, my darling. My sweet girl. Mama's here. Mama's right here. Please come back to me. Please. I know I've done wrong. I know I've failed you. But please, please don't leave me. You're all I have. You and Thomas. You're everything." The minutes stretched like hours. Dr. Ashworth worked without pause, her face a mask of concentration, her hands never stopping their constant motion. Mary talked until her voice gave out, then talked some more, a hoarse whisper of love and desperation. And then, miracle of miracles, Clara stirred. It was small at first, just a twitch of one tiny hand. Then a deeper breath, a flutter of eyelids. Then, impossibly, a thin cry, the most beautiful sound Mary had ever heard. "She's coming back." Dr. Ashworth's voice held a note of relief that told Mary just how close they had come. "Keep talking to her. Keep her awake." Mary gathered her daughter into her arms, pressing Clara against her chest, feeling the small heart beating stronger with each passing moment. She was laughing and crying at the same time, tears and joy and terror all tangled together. "Thank you," she gasped. "Thank you. I don't know how to, thank you." Dr. Ashworth stepped back, her face unreadable. But her eyes, when they met Mary's, held something complicated, compassion and anger and a grief that seemed far older than the moment. "She's not out of danger yet," the doctor said quietly. "And we need to talk about how she came to be in this state." The examination room had grown quiet save for Clara's soft, steady breathing, a sound Mary thought she might never take for granted again. Dr. Ashworth had pulled a wooden stool close to the table where Mary sat cradling her daughter, and now the two women faced each other across a gulf that seemed far wider than the few feet between them. The doctor's face was calm, professional, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made Mary want to look away. "Tell me everything," Dr. Ashworth said. "From the beginning." So Mary told her. She told her about William's death and the crushing weight of sudden poverty. About the factory and Mr. Hartley's threats. About Mrs. Grimsby's ultimatum and Mrs. Doyle's well-meaning advice. About the brown bottle on the shelf and the promise of peace it offered. About the desperate mathematics of survival that had led her to pour poison down her daughter's throat. She told it all without excuse, without self-pity, her voice flat and hollow as if she were describing events that had happened to someone else entirely. When she finished, Dr. Ashworth was silent for a long moment. "You're not the first," she finally said. "You're not even the 100th. Mary looked up, startled by the gentleness in the doctor's voice. "I've been studying this for 3 years." Dr. Ashworth rose and moved to the window, her silhouette sharp against the gray light. "Infant mortality in factory districts. The numbers are staggering, thousands of babies dying every year, and the one common thread is these so-called soothing syrups. Godfrey's Cordial. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. Dalby's carminative. They all contain opium, and they're all being given to infants by mothers who have no idea what they're truly administering. But the chemist said it was safe." Mary's voice was barely a whisper. "The label said." "The labels lie." Dr. Ashworth turned back to face her, and now the anger was visible, bright and burning. "The manufacturers know exactly what's in their products. They know the danger. But the cordials are profitable, enormously profitable, and dead babies don't file complaints." Clara stirred in Mary's arms, making a small sound of protest. Mary adjusted her hold automatically, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. "Then why doesn't someone stop them?" "Because the people with power don't want to hear it." Dr. Ashworth's laugh was bitter. "I've presented my findings to the medical society. I've written to Parliament. I've begged and pleaded and demanded that someone, anyone, take action. Do you know what they tell me?" Mary shook her head. "They tell me that the deaths are natural. That factory babies are simply weaker, more prone to illness. That poverty itself is the cause, not the products being sold to desperate mothers." Her hands clenched at her sides. "They tell me that I'm hysterical. That my female constitution makes me unfit to understand the complexities of public health policy. That I should return to midwifery and leave real medicine to real doctors." The bitterness in her voice was old, weathered, the kind that came from years of fighting a battle that never seemed to end. "But you keep trying," Mary said. "I keep trying." Dr. Ashworth met her eyes. "Because those children deserve better. Because their mothers deserve to know the truth. Because someone has to speak for the ones who can't speak for themselves." Something shifted in Mary's chest, a loosening of the terrible knot of guilt that had been strangling her since she'd found Clara so still and silent. It didn't disappear entirely, she suspected it never would. But alongside the guilt, something else was growing. Something that felt almost like purpose. "What can I do?" she asked. Dr. Ashworth studied her for a long moment. "You could tell your story. Not just to me, to others. To the newspapers if they'll listen. To the factory women who are still using the cordial without understanding the danger. Would anyone believe me? Some would. Some wouldn't. But every voice matters. Every mother who speaks up makes it harder for the men in power to pretend this isn't happening." Mary looked down at Clara, at her daughter's small face finally peaceful in natural sleep rather than drugged stupor. She thought of Thomas, waiting at Mrs. Grimsby's, trusting his mother to keep him safe. She thought of William, who had worked himself to death trying to provide for his family, and wondered what he would say if he could see her now. "Be brave," she imagined him whispering. "You were always braver than you knew." "I'll do it," she said. "Whatever you need. I'll tell anyone who will listen." For the first time since Mary had entered the clinic, Dr. Ashworth smiled. It transformed her face, softening the sharp angles, revealing the warmth beneath the professional mask. "Then we have work to do." If this story is stirring something in your heart, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you, especially if you're a mother who knows the impossible weight of keeping children safe in an impossible world. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and revelation. Clara recovered slowly, watched over by Mary during the day and by Dr. Ashworth, Eleanor as she insisted Mary call her, during the stolen hours when Mary had to return to the mill. The foreman had docked her pay for the missed afternoon but had not dismissed her, perhaps sensing that pushing too hard would cause more trouble than it was worth. Mary worked her shifts in a daze, her hands moving automatically while her mind churned with everything she had learned. She watched the other women, some with infants of their own, some with haunted eyes that suggested losses they never spoke of, and wondered how many of them were living the same nightmare she had barely escaped. On the third evening, Eleanor took her to a meeting. It was held in the back room of a pub in Ancoats, far from the respectable streets where medical societies gathered in wood-paneled comfort. The attendees were women, mostly, factory workers and domestic servants, and a few professionals who had somehow clawed their way to education despite a world determined to deny it to them. There were also a handful of men, journalists, reformers, and one pale young clergyman who looked as though he might faint at any moment but refused to leave. "This is the Manchester Society for Infant Protection," Eleanor explained as they found seats on a rough wooden bench. "We've been meeting for 2 years. Gathering evidence. Building support. Waiting for the right moment to bring our case to Parliament. Has the moment come? Perhaps." Eleanor's eyes swept the room. "We have the medical evidence. We have testimony from nurses and chemists. What we've never had is mothers willing to speak publicly about their experiences." Mary understood what she was being asked. The thought of standing before, of exposing her shame and guilt to public scrutiny, made her stomach clench with fear. But then she thought of Clara's blue lips, of Agnes's 3 lost children, of all the tiny graves in pauper cemeteries across Manchester, filled with babies who had been loved and wanted and accidentally killed by mothers trying to survive. "I'll speak," she said. "Tell me what to say." The meeting lasted 3 hours. Mary listened as doctor after doctor presented evidence, as journalists argued about strategy, as reformers debated the best approach to Parliament. It was overwhelming, this world of ideas and arguments that she had never been allowed to enter, but she forced herself to pay attention, to learn, to understand. When her turn came, she stood on trembling legs and told her story. She spoke of William's death and the desperation that followed, of the factory's merciless demands and the impossible choice between working and caring for her children, of Mrs. Doyle's advice in the brown bottle and the morning she had found Clara nearly dead in a straw-lined crate. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry. But her voice shook and her hands trembled, and when she finished, the room was silent with a weight that pressed against her chest. Then the applause began. It was not the polite, restrained clapping of society gatherings. It was something rawer, fiercer, a sound of recognition and solidarity from women who had walked the same paths, faced the same impossible choices, lost the same battles against a world that had never been designed to let them win. Mary stood in the center of that sound, and for the first time in months she did not feel alone. The weeks that followed were filled with meetings and speeches and long nights spent writing letters to anyone who might listen. Mary became Eleanor's shadow, learning the language of reform, discovering that her own experience was a kind of expertise that no medical degree could provide. She spoke at factory gates during shift changes, warning women about the cordials. She visited mothers in tenement rooms, holding their hands and sharing her story. She stood before journalists and watched their faces shift from skepticism to horror as she described in clinical detail what she had nearly done to her own child. Not everyone believed her. Some women clutched their own bottles of Godfrey's Cordial and called her a liar, a hysteric, a woman who couldn't manage her own children and wanted to make others feel guilty for doing what they had to do. Some men laughed at her, dismissing her as another foolish female meddling in matters she didn't understand. But others listened. Others put down their bottles and asked questions and spread the word to their neighbors. Slowly, painfully, one mother at a time, the tide began to turn. And through it all, Clara grew stronger. Mary watched her daughter transform from a sickly, silent infant into a bright-eyed baby who smiled and reached and made the demanding sounds of a child who expected the world to respond to her needs. Each smile was a miracle. Each cry was a gift. Each night, as Mary lay in her narrow bed with Clara asleep beside her and Thomas curled at their feet, she offered silent thanks to whatever force had given her a second chance. She had not deserved it. She had nearly destroyed the most precious thing in her life. But she had been given the opportunity to make amends and she would not waste it. The real test came on a gray November morning, 3 months after Clara's brush with death. Eleanor arrived at Mary's room before dawn, her face alight with a mixture of hope and terror. "Parliament," she said. "They've agreed to hear our petition. A select committee on infant welfare. We present our evidence next week." Mary felt her heart stutter. Parliament. They want testimony from affected families. From mothers. Eleanor took her hands. "They want to hear from you, Mary?" The fear was instant, overwhelming. Mary standing before Parliament? Mary, the factory worker, the widow, the woman who had nearly killed her own daughter? What could she possibly say that men of power would care to hear? But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Something that had been growing since the night Clara had opened her eyes and cried. Rage. Pure, righteous, burning rage at a system that had put her in an impossible position and then blamed her for the choices she had been forced to make. Rage at the manufacturers who knew their products killed and sold them anyway. Rage at the doctors who dismissed the deaths as natural. Rage at everyone who had ever told her that her suffering didn't matter, that her voice didn't count, that she should be grateful for whatever scraps the world saw fit to throw her way. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll tell them everything." On the day of the Parliament meeting, the Houses of Parliament rose from the Thames like a stone cathedral to power, its Gothic spires piercing a sky the color of old bruises. Mary stood on the pavement outside, clutching Eleanor's arm, and felt smaller than she had ever felt in her life. "I can't do this." "You can." Eleanor's grip was firm, grounding. "You've already done the hardest part. You've told your story 100 times. This is just one more telling. This is Parliament. This is a room full of men who need to hear the truth. That's all." Eleanor turned to face her, her eyes fierce. "You have something none of them have, Mary. You have lived this. You have nearly lost everything. That gives your words a power no statistic can match." Mary thought of Clara, safe at home with Thomas and the neighbor girl Eleanor had hired to watch them. She thought of the bottle that still sat on her shelf, empty now, but kept as a reminder of what she had almost done. She thought of all the mothers who would never have the chance to stand where she was standing, whose children were already in the ground. "I am here for them," she told herself. "I am here because they cannot be." She straightened her spine. "Let's go." The committee room was smaller than she had expected, oak-paneled, dim, filled with the musty smell of old paper and older money. A long table dominated the space, behind which sat 7 men in dark suits, their faces arranged in expressions of polite disinterest. Mary had seen such faces before. On landlords collecting rent. On foremen denying wages. On doctors who charged more than a month's salary for 5 minutes of their time. But she had also seen those faces change, sometimes, when confronted with a truth they could not ignore. Eleanor presented the medical evidence first, her voice calm and precise as she laid out statistics and chemical analyses and the damning report from the university laboratory. The committee members listened, some taking notes, others barely concealing their impatience. Then it was Mary's turn. She walked to the front of the room on legs that felt like water. The faces of the committee swam before her. Old men, wealthy men, men who had never known a moment of the desperation that had driven her to pour opium down her daughter's throat. She opened her mouth and for a terrible moment nothing came out. Then she thought of Clara's blue lips, of the weight of her daughter's still body in her arms, of the silence that had stretched between one heartbeat and the next, when she had been certain she would never hear that small heartbeat again. And the words came. My name is Mary Brennan. I am a widow, a factory worker, and a mother of 2. 3 months ago, I nearly killed my infant daughter with Godfrey's Cordial. She heard the intake of breath, saw the shift in posture as the committee's attention sharpened. She pressed on. I gave it to her because I had to work 14 hours a day to keep a roof over our heads. I gave it to her because the woman who minded her while I worked refused to take a crying baby. I gave it to her because everyone, my neighbors, the chemist, even the doctors, told me it was safe. That all mothers used it. That it was medicine. Her voice cracked, but she did not stop. I did not know what was in that bottle. I did not know that every drop contained opium, the same drug that destroys men in opium dens. I did not know that I was slowly poisoning my own child. She looked at the committee members, meeting their eyes one by one. I am not asking for your pity. I made a choice and I will live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of my life. But I am asking, begging, you to make sure that no other mother ever has to make the same choice. She told them about finding Clara barely breathing in Mrs. Grimsby's house. About the desperate run through Manchester streets. About Eleanor's hands working to coax life back into her daughter's body. About the moment Clara had opened her eyes and cried, a sound more beautiful than any music, any poetry, any prayer. She told them about the other mothers she had met in the months since. About the ones who had not been as lucky. About the tiny graves that dotted paupers' cemeteries across the country, filled with children who had been loved and wanted and accidentally killed by parents who had only been trying to survive. These products are poison, she said. The manufacturers know it. The chemists know it. And now you know it too. The only question is what you're going to do about it. She fell silent. The room was utterly still. Then, from the end of the table, an elderly man with white whiskers and watery blue eyes leaned forward. Mrs. Brennan, he said slowly, you speak of thousands of deaths. But the manufacturers claim their products are safe. The medical establishment has raised no alarm. How do you expect us to believe the word of a factory worker over the assurances of educated men? Mary felt the anger rise in her throat, but before she could respond, Eleanor stepped forward. Perhaps, the doctor said, you might believe this. She laid a stack of papers on the table. Death certificates, hundreds of them, each one documenting an infant death attributed to natural causes, in districts where cordial use was highest. I have spent 3 years gathering this evidence, Eleanor said. Every death certificate. Every coroner's report. Every testimony from nurses and midwives who watched babies die and knew what had killed them but were told to keep silent. She spread the papers across the table, a sea of small deaths that no one had ever bothered to count. These are not statistics, gentlemen. These are children. And they are dying because you have allowed them to die. The silence stretched. Mary watched the faces of the committee members, seeing doubt and discomfort and, in a few cases, something that might have been shame. Finally, the elderly man spoke again. This evidence will need to be reviewed, verified. We cannot simply. How long will that take? Mary's voice cut through his equivocation. How many more children will die while you review and verify? How many more mothers will stand in my place, asking themselves if they're the ones who killed their babies? She stepped closer to the table and for once in her life she did not lower her eyes. I have nothing left to lose, sir. My husband is dead. My daughter nearly died. I have been fired from my position for daring to speak about this publicly. The only thing keeping me alive is the hope that maybe, someone with power might finally do something. She spread her hands, a gesture of offering and surrender. You have that power. I'm asking you to use it. Not for me. For every mother in England who is facing the same impossible choices I faced. For every baby who is right now being dosed with poison by parents who love them and don't know any better. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. Please. How many more have to die? The elderly man stared at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, a cracking of the professional mask, a glimpse of the human being beneath. Mrs. Brennan, he said quietly, I think we have heard enough. He turned to his fellow committee members. I move that we recommend immediate action to regulate the sale of opiate-based preparations to infants. Further, I move that we commission a full investigation into the mortality rates Mrs. Brennan and Dr. Ashworth have described. The vote was not unanimous. 2 members abstained, their faces tight with disapproval. But the majority carried. For the first time in 3 years, someone with power had listened. At last, victory and redemption was in sight. The legislation did not pass immediately. Nothing in Parliament ever did. But the committee's recommendation sparked a fire that could not be contained. Newspapers that had ignored Eleanor's evidence for years suddenly discovered a burning interest in infant mortality. Mothers who had suffered in silence found their voices, standing up in churches and meeting halls and factory yards to share their stories. Chemists who had quietly profited from the cordial trade began removing the products from their shelves, unwilling to be associated with what one editorial called a national disgrace. Mary Brennan became briefly famous. She did not want fame. She wanted only to return to her ordinary life, to raise her children in peace, to forget the terrible morning when she had found Clara nearly dead and known that she was the one responsible. But she understood now that ordinary life was a luxury she could not afford. Not while other mothers were still facing the same impossible choices. Not while bottles of Godfrey's Cordial still sat on chemists' shelves. Not while children were still dying. So she kept speaking, kept fighting, kept standing up in rooms full of people who did not want to hear what she had to say and saying it anyway. 3 months after the parliamentary hearing, the Infant Life Protection Act passed its first reading. It was not everything Eleanor had hoped for. There were loopholes and compromises and provisions that would take years to enforce. But it was a beginning. For the first time in British history, the government had acknowledged its responsibility to protect children from dangerous products. Mary was not there for the vote. She was home, in the small room that she had somehow managed to keep through all the chaos of the past months, watching Clara take her first steps. Her daughter had grown strong and healthy, the blue tinge long gone from her lips, her eyes bright with curiosity about the world. Thomas, now 6, was attending a charity school that Eleanor had helped arrange, learning to read and write and dream of futures beyond the factory walls. Mary herself had found work as an assistant at Eleanor's clinic, helping other mothers navigate the medical system, sharing her story with those who needed to hear it. It was not easy work and the pay was barely enough to survive on, but for the first time in her life she felt that her labor meant something. She was holding Clara's hands, guiding her wobbly steps across the floor, when Eleanor arrived with the news. It passed, the doctor said, her face alight. Not everything we wanted, but enough. The cordials will have to be labeled. Manufacturers will have to disclose their ingredients. And there will be inspections, real inspections with consequences for violations. Mary sank onto the edge of her bed, still holding Clara's hands. Her daughter gurgled happily, oblivious to the magnitude of the moment. "We did it," she said softly. "You did it." Eleanor knelt beside her, taking her free hand. "Your testimony changed everything, Mary. The committee chairman told me afterward. He said he had never seen anything like it. He said you made him see those children as real. As human beings who deserved better." Mary thought of all the mothers she had met over the past months. The ones who had lost children and blamed themselves. The ones who had been told that their grief was foolish, that babies simply died sometimes, that there was nothing to be done. "It's not enough," she said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "It's not. But it's a start. And we'll keep fighting until it is enough." Clara tugged at Mary's hands, demanding attention. Mary lifted her daughter into her lap, pressing her face into the soft warmth of Clara's hair. "I nearly lost you," she whispered. "I nearly lost everything." Clara patted her mother's face with one small hand, babbling nonsense sounds that might have been an attempt at words. Mary laughed through sudden tears. "I know," she said. "I know. Mama's being silly." But she held on a moment longer, memorizing the weight of her daughter in her arms, the sound of her breathing, the miracle of her continued existence. She had been given a second chance. Not everyone was so lucky. But because she had been lucky, because Clara had survived, she could fight for those who hadn't. She could speak for the mothers who were still suffering and the children who were still at risk. It was not redemption exactly. She would never fully forgive herself for what she had almost done. But it was something close. It was purpose. It was meaning. It was a reason to keep getting up every morning and facing a world that had never been designed to let women like her survive. The evening light slanted through the window, turning the shabby room golden. Thomas came running in from the street, full of stories about his day at school, and Mary listened with half an ear while Clara played with the buttons on her dress. This was her family. Broken and imperfect and scarred by losses that would never fully heal. But alive. Together. Fighting for something that mattered. It was enough. For now it was enough. 20 years later. The lecture hall at the University of Manchester was filled to capacity. In the front row sat a young woman with her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn chin. Clara Brennan, Clara Ashworth as she now styled herself, having taken her godmother's name when she entered medical school, listened intently as the elderly professor described the history of infant welfare legislation in Britain. The turning point came in 1868, the professor said, when a factory worker named Mary Brennan testified before a parliamentary select committee. Her testimony, and the evidence compiled by Dr. Eleanor Ashworth, led directly to the first Infant Life Protection Act. Clara felt a familiar surge of pride. Her mother rarely spoke of those days anymore, preferring to focus on the present rather than the past. But Clara knew the stories by heart. She had grown up on them, had shaped her entire life around them. After the lecture, she walked through the gray streets to the small house where her mother now lived. Comfortable, respectable, paid for by years of work at the clinic that had grown from Eleanor's original free service into one of the most respected medical facilities in Manchester. Mary was in the garden, hands deep in the soil, coaxing life from the tiny patch of earth behind her house. At 62, her hair was silver and her hands were gnarled, but her eyes still held the same fierce determination that had carried her through the darkest days of her life. "How was the lecture?" Mary asked without looking up. "They talked about you." "They always do." Mary smiled, the expression softening her weathered face. "I hope they got the facts right this time. Last year they had me delivering a speech to Parliament in my nightgown." Clara laughed, settling onto the small bench beside the garden. "They got it mostly right. Though they did leave out the part about how terrified you were." "I was terrified." Mary straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "I was terrified every single day. But terror is not the same as defeat. I learned that from you in a way." "From me?" Mary crossed to sit beside her daughter, taking her hand the way she had done when Clara was small and learning to walk. "When I found you that morning, when I thought I had lost you, I felt a fear worse than anything I had ever experienced. But then you opened your eyes. You cried. You came back to me." She squeezed Clara's fingers. "And I realized that if I could survive that fear, I could survive anything. I could face anything. Because the worst had already almost happened and we had both come through." Clara leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "I don't remember any of it, you know." "I know. And I'm glad." Mary's voice was soft. "But I remember enough for both of us. I remember and I'm grateful every single day." They sat in silence as the sun began to set, two women who had survived impossible odds, whose lives had been shaped by a bottle of poison and the desperate love that had nearly destroyed them both. But they were here. They were alive. They were together. And in the end, that was the only story that mattered. This story was inspired by true historical events. Between 1850 and 1900, it is estimated that thousands of infants in Britain died from opium-based soothing syrups like Godfrey's Cordial, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, and similar products. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1872 and subsequent legislation eventually led to regulations requiring disclosure of dangerous ingredients, though it took decades for the practice to fully end. The mothers who used these products were not villains. They were women trapped in impossible circumstances, doing what they believed was best for their children with the information available to them. If this story touched you, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part moved you most? And if you've experienced the impossible weight of choices that no parent should have to make, know that you are not alone, and your voice matters more than you know. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.